Here we are again. We're in Rome. You see the Tiber, how it wanders around. It can be sometimes confusing if you walk a straight line between the island that you can see in the middle, if I can get to that, where the ghetto was, straight line this way. All of a sudden the river isn't there, and then it comes back. And here is the Vatican. Now, mind you, these are not big distances. This is, maybe a little more than a kilometer and a half, from where the ghetto was to the Vatican itself. While we're at it, I would add that if you are on this bridge called Ponte Garibaldi, right near the ghetto, and you walk about 2/3 of the way across, and you look to your right, you'll see the modern synagogue, which is a huge building built in 1904. I may be off a year, with funds from the Roman civic authorities. Why would the Roman civic authorities want to support the Jews? Because the Roman civic authorities were all excommunicated by the guy who lives here, the Pope. They wanted to show that they were lay, that they had nothing to do with the church. They didn't look. Actually, the mayor of the city at the time was a man named Natan, who was Jewish. But in any case, if you go 2/3 of the way through across here, and you look to your right, you'll see the synagogue, and you look to your left, you'll see the Vatican, and they look like they're exactly the same height. That was not done by chance. As we said, life in the ghetto at the end of the middle of the 19th century was very, very difficult, and the ghetto was going to be torn down. But what was going on in the ghetto? Well, what was Jewish life like? I don't want to tell you that Jewish life was a vale of tears. It was much, much more. It was very vibrant. And that vibrance can be found in so many ways, in so many forms, in the way the families worked, in the way that traditions worked, in the way that ceremonies worked, in the way that self-perception worked. And that's what I want to talk about for the next hour. When the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, why Spain? Because so many of them came to live in Italy and in Rome. The Roman Jewish population was about 1,500. The population was made up of Italkim, as they called themselves. In other words, those who had always been in Rome, those who were really Italian in every sense of the word. And we're going to end today's talk talking about food, and Italian food indeed. And the people came in who were Sephardim, a certain number of Ashkenazim. Ashkenazim generally tend to settle in the north. In Venice, it's a very clear Ashkenazi presence. In other cities, Verona, there, yes, but not in Rome. In Rome, it's a very small group, although, in fact, we find the Jews organizing themselves according to different groupings in their synagogues. There were at least 5 synagogues, and the groupings were interesting, because you have the Italkim, and then you have the Sicilians, Jews who came from Sicily. They were expelled from the Crown of Aragon, of course, in 1492, but for some reason they were classed with the Italkim. But you did have a synagogue. You had an Ashkenazi synagogue. It was very small. You had the Castigliane Francese, of all things, why it should be that, and the Aragonese synagogue. And those synagogues, the Sephardi synagogues, actually had a good deal of friction among them. It's often said that Jews at this time in Rome, when they came, had a lot of ethnic friction. Now, I don't like the word ethnic for the 16th century. It's much too 20th or 21st century. I would rather use the word nazione, which means place of origin. In fact, they didn't do as badly as is usually said. Of course, there was friction at first. People come, people settle. Who are these people? What are they? What are their modes of living? Is it all right? Well, bit by bit, those differences disappeared. But in fact, for all that it's been said, there was a great deal of friction. The only real case of friction that I've ever been able to find were between the two Sephardi congregations, the Catalana Aragonese against the Castigliana Francese. And what were they arguing about? Who had the right to give the drasha, the sermon, first on the holiday of Sukkot? Now, synagogues did litigate all right. They litigated all the time because from about the 1530s, 5 of them were organized in the same building. I don't have a picture of it for you, I'm sorry. But they were organized all in one building, and there were always fights about who wanted to move a door and who wanted to move a staircase and so on. Unfortunately, that building, which was preserved into the 20th century, was burnt down again in the very early years of the 20th century, and so we do not have it. It's most unfortunate because it would be a wonderful relic to have, but we don't. And in fact, what we have today is the Tempio Maggiore, the great synagogue that I just mentioned, and down in the basement there is the Sephardi synagogue, but the differences aren't great. Why aren't the differences great? Well, in the year 1524, it became very clear that there were different groups and they needed to organize themselves as one unit. They needed to be one unit because, among other things, they had to deal with the authorities in the city, with all the authorities in the city, of course, being churchmen, ecclesiastics. They had to deal with the Pope. And they asked the banker, member of the important banking family da Pisa, Daniel da Pisa, they asked him to draw up a series of capitoli, or charters, which he did in 1524, and it was given approval by a formal papal letter. Now, people say, well, we can see the friction in that charter because he says that of the fattori, the factors, the people who are supposed to lead the community, 2 of them are supposed to be italkim, and 1 is supposed to be an ultramontanos. Ultramontanos, the other side of the mountains, of course, being the Alps. You may know that the Alps are an incredible barrier. It's only since 1964 that you can go through with a tunnel. You used to have to actually go over passes until 1964. The Daniel da Pisa writes this charter, and it does divide between Sephardim or Ultramontane, which is everybody, Ashkenazim, Sephardim, and the other Jews. But in fact, if you really look at it carefully, when he talks about representation, he talks about creating 2 councils, a council of 20 and a council of 60, it really works out that the differences are much more economic, exactly what one would expect. What these councils did was mostly to levy taxes. There were always need to pay taxes. The Pope demanded taxes, and not unfair taxes, by the way. One of the interesting things is that from 1470, the popes decided to learn how to levy direct taxes. That is, to go to communities and say, give us 5% of your income. They started it with the Jews. And it was a very fair taxation, actually, and they had so much success that they started to apply it to other groups. And who paid the most? Not the Jews. The monks, they paid up to 20%. The popes knew who to fleece. It's only toward the middle of the 16th century, when pressure starts to grow, that they exchange this fair taxation for fines, saying the Jews were taking too much interest. And that leads us into where we were in the first meeting. But I don't want to go into that in depth now. I want to talk about how the Jews ran their community and how the Jews managed with their community to survive. And my feeling is that they survived because prior to 1555, prior to the establishment of the ghetto, they had found a modus vivendi in many sectors, and they had found a way to live together, and they had found a way to do things uniformly throughout the community. You know, there are lots of things which can be different. For instance, nikur. the cleaning of the hindquarters of beef, where we will get to ultimately. That they're different. The different communities, different Jewish communities, have different rules about this thing. Ultimately, they found a way to do it together. They found other interesting things to do together too, important things. For instance, let's deal with chalitza. Chalitza, as we all know, can be a real problem. It can be a real problem because if chalitza, for those who don't know, in other words, if somebody dies childless and he has a brother, the brother is supposed to marry the widow. This is called levirate marriage. And obviously, it's a real burden, and nobody wants to deal with it. And there has to be something called yibum, and this requires a ceremony called chalitza, actually the throwing of a shoe. But how do you get people to do this, to accept this? Because it's a very easy way. Somebody could say, hey, I'd like to get some money out of my sister-in-law. My brother didn't leave me enough. I'm going to get it. And life can go on. In Rome, they resolved the problem magnificently. When people made wedding contracts, every brother had to swear to accept the chalitza. And if there was a child still in the womb, the father had to swear for that child too. In other words, they guaranteed that nobody would be held up. There are other things too that we're going to see. They also worked out ways of agreement for tanaim, for premarital agreements. And because one group said that if the engagement is broken, then one has to return a third. One said a half of the goods. If the bride dies, if the husband dies within a year, things have to be returned. They worked out a way to do this kind of thing together. How did they do it? By inventing something that I alluded to last time, which is Jewish notaries. Jewish notaries did not exist. You had a sofer, somebody who would write down meetings or minutes or something. But somebody who was actually trained almost as a secular lawyer, and a lay lawyer, I want to stress that. Lay, somebody who knew what was the notary's art and skill of writing documents. That is something that appears in Rome in 1536, in the family of the Piatelli. The Piatelli actually claim that they were among the original Jewish families of Rome, the Anav, but we'll leave that aside. The father, Judah, and the son, Isaac Piatelli, for over 60 years, Isaac was drawing notarial acts, as they're called, for 65 years, worked out a system of making uniformity throughout the community, wills, testaments, all kinds of things like that. They created a true basis for common Jewish existence, bringing these various groups together. And no doubt that they're doing that also encouraged the fact that within 20 or 40 years, 30 years, you find a great deal of outmarriage. Don't jump, I don't mean marriage between Jews and Christians. That was illegal. It was absolutely impossible unless one party converted, and of course it had to be to Christianity. Illegal before the time of the French Revolution. So not intermarriage, but outmarriage, that is between two different Jewish groups, as if a Sephardi and an Ashkenazi in Israel marry. Now what's interesting is that there have been studies of outmarriage in Israel, and studies about, and I looked at those percentages, and I was able, through looking at the records these notaries left, there are at least 6,000 documents that I've been able to work up, and I look at them, the percentage of increasing outmarriage in Rome in the 40 years between, say, 1520 and 1560, that is before the ghetto and just into the ghetto period, is identical with what happened in Israel. The rate of outmarriage in Israel is much higher than many people think. It's 20, 30, even 40%, and maybe even more today when the study that I read was made 30, 40 years ago. And I'm sure that today it's much higher. And so it got to the point that by 1570, when they listed members of the Gemilut Chasadim Society, in other words, the Chevra Kadisha. There was one for Ashkenazim and one for Sephardim. While there still was a need to have that, I'm not quite sure, but they have them, and they say you have to indicate whether you're a Sephardi or whether you're not, whether you're an Italki. It was just amazing because nobody knew. Very, very few people know anymore in Rome whether they're Sephardim or Italkim. They can tell a little bit by the family names. And oh yes, Jews have very, very definite family names. They do not, you don't need to hear somebody called Kohen or Schwartz or Levi in order to know they're Jewish in Rome. There are also names like Di Tivoli, Di Veroli, Calo. I could go on. The list is there are at least 100 family names. Milano, of all things. That's because somebody used to go to Milano to collect taxes. Toscano, somebody used to go to Tuscany, Florence, to collect taxes for the Jewish community. So there are very special names which Jews in Italy have, and everybody recognizes them and everybody knows them. By everybody, I mean not only the Jews, but the not Jews. Well, what I'm saying, therefore, is that we have this incredible treasure trove of documentation created by these two notaries. And I will tell you something, they're writing in Hebrew. They only later on in the 16th century do we start to get texts in Italian, which is another story, but they're writing in Hebrew. And they're amazing. Yehuda's handwriting is Yehuda's handwriting. You can't mistake it for anyone else's. And of course, obviously nothing's in print. And Isako's handwriting is Isako's handwriting. And when you start reading these things, as I did on a day-by-day basis, it was almost like I was reading print. They're so precise, so clear. And so, thanks to this amazing treasure trove of documents, we can learn what life within the ghetto is like. Indeed, I claimed at one point that what the Jews had was something called a theater of acculturation, as the name of the book I wrote, because acts repeat, actions repeat. The Jews are the theater, they are the audience, and they are the actors at the same time. And they're acting, the action, the play is repetitive action, a social theater, as I've also called it. And we see from these things how Jewish family life worked. And here it was very distinct, because in the 16th century, thanks to the Counter-Reformation and the Catholic Reformation, the Church attempted to control and get its hands on everything in education, in family life, without fail. Not a thing was missing. Who was supposed to direct the family and what it was to do? It was supposed to be the spiritual advisor, in other words, the priest. The priest was to tell people when they could be together, couples when they could be together, when they could be intimate together, and so on and so forth. Priests were supposed to direct education. They were the ones in charge of education. In Judaism, who's in charge of the education? The father. And we have fathers, records of fathers bringing food to children in school at midday. Admittedly, that text comes because there was a question of paternity, who was the father of a certain child. But they say, oh no, he was the father. We know he was the father. He used to bring the child lunch in school every day. This was, of course, somebody who had died and the mother had remarried. And they wanted to check these things out. The organizations like the Chevra Kadisha, they had the Gemilut Chasadim. Oh yes, they had a rabbi. They had a rabbi for advice. But one of the salient things is in Rome that the rabbis are there, but the rabbis do not run the community. Somebody's recently tried to say they did. They absolutely did not. The major studies of rabbis in Rome makes it very clear. Rabbis were kind of ancillary. The piatelis, the notaries, they were rabbis too. But they were not the ones running the community. The community was run by the Council of 20 and the larger Council of 60. Now, when it comes to things like schools, for instance, it's very interesting what is going on in those schools, because we find that not only are fathers responsible, but supposedly mothers are responsible for daughters, and yet mothers can also be responsible for children. I just want to read you, though, part of a small text, which is a contract. We have all kinds of contracts of teachers. What were schools like? Well, unsurprisingly, we have the very wealthy who hire tutors for their children. Then we have a Talmud Torah, which is a major organization in the school, in the community, and all children were supposed to, all boys certainly were supposed to go to the Talmud Torah. The girls too learned how to read and sometimes had to write. What were called lavori femminili, which really means fine embroidery, and part of the fine embroidery was writing phrases, prayers, brachot, on Torah covers, on the mat that was placed on the bima. All these things had to be done, and the women who were doing it had to be able to read enough to write these things. But we also know that the women they were apprenticed to were indeed engaged and told they have to teach these people to prayer. Well, here is just a contract, and you'll see how complex it could be. An agreement between Eliezer HaKohen, the Abramo Kohen, the Terracina of Rome, Terracina would become a family name, and Marchigiana, wife of Isaac Raphael. Marchigiana transfers to Eliezer 13 pupils of her husband Isaac. These include the 5 sons of so and so and so and so. And the money will be divided equally between the one and the other. The agreement is valid for 2 months. Afterwards, Eleazar is entitled to all the pupils' fees. Sounds, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. It's schools and tuition and agreements and finance. There's nothing new under the sun when it comes to that. Now, and one of the things, by the way, that we do learn from all these documents about, like, for the education, the Gemilut Chasadim, the Talmud Torah, they needed plumbing. And it's absolutely amazing. We have a whole series of documents which talk about how they took a plumbing line from the latrines which were in the building of the Gemilut Chasad, of the Talmud Torah, and brought it to a larger sewage line that was outside the ghetto. This, by the way, is very modern in itself and suggests about the way Jews were living in Rome. Because when one goes and says, I want to study the history of public sanitation, sewage, and so on and so forth, most of it begins in the 19th century in France, in England. It's only in Rome, perhaps because water was considered sacred in some way by the church, it's only in Rome that you have an entire sewer system from the 16th century, and the Jews are part of this, and we have the exact documentation explaining exactly how it was to be done and exactly what the plans were. It's rather amazing. Well, as we said, the Jews in this ghetto, which they were maintaining, they were living in nostro ghet. Now, the ghet could be symbolized in many ways. One way it could be symbolized was by the tekiyat shofar. Of all things, Jewish music, if you go to a Roman synagogue today, or to some extent the Tempio Italiano on Rehov Hillel in Jerusalem, where, by the way, which is a complete reproduction of a northern Italian synagogue with the ark, actually an 18th century Italian ark, and down in the museum downstairs, a number of arks from there. I urge everyone to see this. This is a different Italian culture than the ones which non-Italians are known about or know about. Well, if one goes to there, if one goes on Rosh Hashanah to the Roman Tempio Maggiore, which has the world's worst acoustics, by the way, because it's like being in the mouth of a cone, the shofar is blown uniquely to Rome. It's a series of undulating notes. It's not tkiya, shvarim, trua. It's not broken up like that. It's all one series of notes, and I guarantee you the first time I heard it on Rosh Hashanah about 40 years ago, I simply had smarmoret. I had goosebumps. It was so amazing. So there are things which are very much theirs. What about Jews going in and out of the ghetto? Well, the ghetto was porous. The gates were open in the morning and closed at night. When they were open, Christians came in to do business. Sometimes they abused this. For instance, a miller trying to get a shortcut drove a wagon full of flour at breakneck speed through the ghetto, and he was stopped, and there was a riot, and he was actually kicked to death. And we know exactly about this event. So it's not that there were no non-Jews in the ghetto. Non-Jews came in all the time, and Jews went out of the ghetto to do business. All kinds of businesses that they did, down to the point that today, even in Rome, if you go to buy if you're a Christian pilgrim and you go to buy a statue, it's very likely that the person selling it to you is a Jew, or at least that was the case until about 20 years ago. I think it's being taken over by others now as Jews move into more sophisticated occupations. But there's something that we really learn. To what extent we want to ask, what extent were people friendly, Jews and Christians? There have been attempts to say, oh, they got along terrifically. And there are attempts to say, no, everything is closed. In fact, it was somewhere in the middle, and I think that this particular text that I'm going to read you a part of now will make it clear. It turns out that a poor Jew, Moshe Sarfadi, out trying to make some money, he dropped his hat. He dropped his hat on the ground, and it became soaked with rain, which somehow a guardian, a civil guard of Rome, took as an insult who was passing from. And he gave the Jew 4 piatonate puntate, 4 hits with sharp blades of a bayonet. That happened 10 days before, and Sarfati was still languishing near death in a hospital. To make matters worse, other guardsmen, now we're in the 1790s by the way, had entered the pub where Sarfati's companion, Angelo Frascati, was drinking a foglietta, a measure of wine, at the invitation of due cristiani suoi amici, 2 Christian friends. The guardsman poured the wine over Frascati's head. Okay, so here we have this interesting structure of a Jew and a Christian, a Jew drinking with his Christian friends in the bar. Italian Jews, by the way, have no real problem, or traditionally have had no real problem drinking non-kosher wine just for when they're simply drinking. Well, the Jewish leadership was indignant, and it addressed the head of the guards. This outrage, they said, insults in principi delle leggi naturali, natural law, and even more the carità, the fundamental justice that every Christian must embrace, in which we deve amare ogni suo simile. He must love all those like him, every other human beings, sia nazionale, sia estero, sia della stessa religione, sia diversa, sia amico, sia anche nemico, regardless of whether that person is a co-national, a foreigner of the same religion or another. Well, this sounds like Enlightenment talk, and this, as I said, is the 1790s. And then the Jews go on. Are we not, the Jews demand, citizens? We are not slaves, even in this church state. We are subjects on a par with the others, and here they cite, of all things, the ancient Roman law. Now, this is a wonderful, wonderful picture before us. The Jews know the law. They know the Roman law. They know what I call jus commune. They know that they are citizens in that. Wait a minute, how can we say Jews in the ghetto are citizens? We said they're depressed, they're under special legislation. This was the craziest thing of all in Rome. Civilly, Jews are cives, they're citizens in every sense, and every jurist who writes about it, including De Susanis, who I mentioned earlier, every one of them says, yes, Jews are citizens, absolutely. But they're limited when it comes to religion. And so when it comes to religion, things aren't so nice. And here the Jews are saying, but this is just a civil issue. We have to be treated properly. In other words, Jewish life is a life that is not closed in the ghetto. It's a life in which the Jews know what's going outside, they know their rights, and they know what is to go on. That said, What are they doing with their lives and with themselves in the ghetto? First of all, we know that though they are Italian speakers, they're also speaking a little bit of a dialect, Judeo-Romanesco. And Judeo-Romanesco still slightly continues, especially for words about the non-Jews or perhaps the person who comes to clean the house, who is known as Lazodde, which is Hazoti, of course, and it's got some Hebrew in it. It has interesting things like doubling plurals. You have the festival of Purim, but it's Purimii. They'll talk about. They'll double the plural. But there's another thing too which we find, and there are stories in Judeo-Romanesco which were written, most of them close to 100 years old. There's sonnets in Judeo-Romanesco written by a man named Beli. Beli was a priest, but he knew the dialect of the Jews, which, like all Jewish dialects, has a certain amount of Hebrew in it. What about the Italian? Well, when the notaries are writing, remember, they're writing in Hebrew, but they're really thinking in Italian. For instance, the most salient example is when it comes to renting a house, somebody says, well, he rented Beit Shela. Beit Shela, her house? Well, was all people who rented homes were women? No, not at all. It was much more interesting. In Italian, house is casa, and house is feminine. Right? These people were thinking in Italian, and they made Beit, for some reason or other, was one of those words with a feminine ending, but it's really masculine. They made Beit feminine, and so you have every house rented is Beit Shela. There's no question these people were thinking in Italian. I once wrote a small article about this thing. It's rather clear that you can point it out and show it how their Hebrew differs from what would be modern Hebrew, and the reason it differs is because it's loaded with Italian. These Jews were Italians in every sense of the word. One of the ways in which they were Italians was the way they handled marriage, the rituals of marriage. Today, you have erusin, which I understand is not a halakhic category in and of itself, and then you go and you have a chuppah, and you have the kiddushin, and then you have the sheva brachot, in other words, the marriage. And the chuppah, of course, is a house, a symbol of the house. Well, in Italy, the non-Jews did it differently. They had an erusin, and then they had a kind of kiddushin ceremony, and that the matrimonial, that would be the equivalent of the Jewish kiddushin. The Jews will have the Tanaim and the kiddushin 2 or 3 weeks after the erusin, and then they could wait time, months, maybe even a year or 2 years, till they actually had the notze, the chuppah itself. And so we have situations like that, and here I want to bring you the story of a woman named Rika, because this is one of the most amazing texts that I found in the whole collection of these notarial documents. Because from Rika we will see how much the Jews have melted into Italian life, but also how much they're still very much Jewish. It is public knowledge, the text goes, that some years ago a match, a chitun, was made between a modest and educated young lady named Rika. Note the names. The names of women's names are all names like Rika or Rosa or Caracosa or Caradona, names like that. And this, by the time, is a time when Christians have started to name their children after saints. Men, by the way, maintain Hebrew names. But there's nothing unusual about this in Italy. If you read the Crusade documents, the Crusade chronicles from the 12th century, the women carry names like this, Latinate-based names. A modest and educated young lady named Rika, the daughter of the late and illustrious Mr. Gershon and the wise and well-educated Menachem, son of the illustrious and exalted Salomone de Pisa. But at present, Rika does not consent. It's not her opinion, to marry. Lehinaseit is the word they use, the young man. For, she says, he never smiles at me. In fact, he spurns me. Mu'asba. The match was made strictly for money. This she said today, April 1, 1556, right in her own home, in front of the witnesses whose names appear below. And the names are Rabbi Abraham Odiaron Skatsokio, another Jewish name, and Rabbi Judah ben Rabbi Sabato Papiatele. When the illustrious Mrs. Gentledona, Rika's mother, heard all this, she erupted in anger. "My child," she said, "I don't like what I'm hearing. As far as I'm concerned, what's right is for you to go to your mate. I beg you not to bring my hoary head down to the grave in sorrow." That's Breshit 42:38. I will give to you your entire dowry at once. I'll add to it. After all, your mate is from an illustrious family, as everyone knows. Nobody has said anything bad to say about him, and has many personal merits. So, my daughter, if you've considered reneging, forget it. This thing, the match, was God's doing. Done in heaven, of course. The match is made in heaven. Unite with your intended and make me happy. Nevertheless, Rika refused, me'ana, and she explained herself, saying, when they married me, hisiua, I was underage, katana. Now that I'm mature, be'alidei gedolim, I spurn him, ma'us. I do not want him. I do not desire him. And especially since I've heard what he said to my mother. But the first thing is those 3 lines. I don't want him, I won't have him. This is actually a halakhic formula for divorce, but it's a special one. But here it's being applied generally. And what I heard my groom say to my mother, even to my face, that my father, Solomon, the groom's father, acted hastily to make a match for me. I'd rather wait another 10 years before taking a wife. Besides, I've endured all kinds of vilification and slurs from my intended, so I've not the slightest doubt that all he did was for money. I'll tell you 3 times over that even were I to be given 1,000, I'd never marry him. Rika said these things. Her mother glowered. And then she added something else, Rika did. She said, since he, the fiancé, left Rome, he's never written me once, not a single line. Well, this is heart-throbbing, rending, oh my, poor thing, with formula. The whole thing is formulaic. The whole thing is theatrical. The whole thing is set up, and the one who's setting it up is Rika's mother, because they had another match and they wanted to get rid of the first one. He didn't want it. The first one, they had a match made which ended with a marriage that lasted well over 20 years. And over 20 years at this period of time is a long, long time, because the average marriage length was about 8 or 9 years, with not divorce but death, of course, being the one that brought the marriage to the end. But this document, it's chock full of halakhic formulas, and then the business about writing a letter. Oh, how sweet, how kind. Nonsense. It is a legal precedent, because it turns out that another engagement had been broken about 30 years before, exactly because the daughter said to her father, since he left Rome, he hasn't written me. In other words, it was a legal precedent. Well, you see how the Jews of Rome work. This is an incredible, incredible document. I read it and I read it and I read it. It must have taken me 10 years till I finally figured out what was in this thing. How amazing the document was, the structure, the sophistication, the way of making it look like going to court and crying. You've seen these things. You've seen soap operas. Well, here it is, the 16th century version of it. But at the same time, what we have here is acculturation. Now, acculturation, that is, what's acculturation? It means I don't dress like a 16th century Polish noble. I dress like a 21st century average person, as do most of the people we meet in our daily lives. That's acculturation. I speak English, I speak Hebrew, but at the same time, I'm very Jewish in very, very many ways. So this is what acculturation is. It's not assimilation, it's not losing identity, it's reinforcing identity, but yet borrowing and assimilating outside culture. And here I bring a lovely, lovely example of this thing. Its an example is an adoption. Of Because what I'm trying to get you to understand here in this talk, if you think about where we've gone, is here's the community, it comes together of various people, it finds a single way to move along, it structures to have what I call a theatricality, but it also learns to acculturate. The Rika is following Roman methods of marriage, and yet it's very Jewish in the halakhic content of it and the present. Here is an even more interesting one, the question of adoption. Now, adoption is something that is very modern in the sense of a truly formal institution. Adoption is really something from the mid-20th century in the way that we know it today. But here we have a question of how do you adopt children, because people were somehow or other always adopted. Now, when it came to non-Jews, what they used to do is if they wanted to adopt, if they wanted a child, and it really didn't matter whether the child was a boy or girl, they simply wanted a child, they would take this person, and in order to cement the relationship, they would give what was called a donatio inter vivos, a gift between live people, which is a legal term to mean an irrevocable gift. Hebrew, as we'll immediately see, matana gemura. They would give a gift to the person. In the case of a family of Angelo, son of Solomon Scazzocchio and his wife Diana, they weren't young in 1569 when they adopted a girl named Tutto Bene, everything is good is her name. And they are told to love the child as their own daughter. Well, you'd have that in Christians who are doing a similar thing. But they do something else. They make a very Jewish term change to the thing. Whereas the Christians, if they would adopt or de facto adopt, would give a donatio inter vivos, the Jews, at the advice of Isacco Piatelli, our notary, make the child. The child is a donatio inter vivos. That is, they have her for life. She cannot be given up. It's a real, true adoption in every sense of the term. And then to make the adoption really emotional, and so to complete the adoption, Angelo and Diana changed the child's name from Tutto Bene, that of her natural grandmother, to Graziosa, the name of her now adoptive grandmother. Roman Jews always name children after grandparents. It doesn't matter whether they're living. It's not the Ashkenazi custom, which this would be, anathema. It's quite the opposite. The grandfather, grandchild, grandfather, grandmother, granddaughter. It made it very easy, by the way, to try to find out generations in families because of this alternation of names. But they do this, they make her theirs in every sense of the term. In other words, they make it a very Jewish thing, even though they've taken and they've adopted something from the outside. And now a third and final example of this kind of thing is the question of the knot. What is a knot? The knot, you can look it up. You'll find it's a classic euphemism for saying masculine lack of virility. And we have a story here. I don't really have enough time, I see, to read the whole thing to you, but I shall try to read part of it because the text is too good itself. It seems that a man named Shem Tov Soporto, there's a Sephardi name for you, he got married and he was not able to consummate the marriage. And he said, I didn't do it until the third night because I was tied. In other words, he had a knot. And I was cured by an old man to whom I gave a few cords. I was able to do the job, he said. He was happy and in good spirits. Chaim Anubo de Moshe of Rome said that 15 days earlier, at the exit of Sabbath, he was in the house of Shem Tov, and Shem Tov told him, do you not know what happened to me? He had been tied and he couldn't take his wife's virginity. Shem Tov recounted that he'd been tied by a close friend he never would have expected. But the knot was undone, now listen to this, by a goy who led him down to the river where there was a ladder made out of millstones, and there he had Shem Tov urinate following instructions. It's on the millstones, by the way. And then I bought my wife. Finally, Gemma, the older widow of Giuseppe Bonanno, testified that the day after the wedding, she had gone to see if Rika was scoperchiata. You'll love the words. Her lid was off. It was not. Rika was a virgin. So she asked Shem Tov if he had in fact come to her in the way of a husband and if he had touched her. He replied he had, to which he reported, "You came to her, certainly not." The next day they called again, and Shem Tov told her that now he knew this was from God, for they had laid down upon him. Gemma was again called on Saturday the next day, and she saw the blood of Betulim, and she said, "Finally, yes, but I won't say anybody because I don't have an evil tongue." God help us. Anyway, but what happens next? What happens next is very interesting. The story itself is great, but there's a lot of differences. Because if it were a Christian, we have cases of Christians who are also tied. They go to a priest, an exorcist, who works it out of him. The Jew goes to a non-Jew. It's not sacred, it's secular, and urinates on millstones. Now, millstones tend to have a role in this kind of thing and all kinds of other situations. But here, again, we have Jews and Christians living in Rome, doing the same things, having the same kind of problems, but the resolutions are entirely different. And indeed, the one final difference here, which really counts. If you are a Christian and you accuse your bride of not being a virgin, and it turns out that the accusation was false, you pay a fine to whom? Her father. The rabbinical solution here, because it was a rabbinical solution, was that the groom had to pay a very large addition to the tosefet, to the woman herself. There was a certain amount of respect of the woman herself. Indeed, there is respect to women themselves, much more than one might expect in a community which was patriarchal, of course. All communities at this time are patriarchal. There's giving to her something, respecting to her. And this also occurred with inheritances. Women could inherit rather freely, which the Christian authorities did not like, but the Jews were doing it anyway. I could go on with many of these things. But let me come to a case now of which will be the last one I will bring you with a discussion, which is of Tranquillo Corcos. Tranquillo Corcos is the one rabbi in the entire Ghetto period who we really know about. We have some vague knowledge about others. There really wasn't a great flowering of learning and so on and so forth. Tranquillo Corcos lived from 1660 to 1730. He was a savant, he was learned in theology, in Christian theology, Christian texts. He used to debate with Christian ecclesiastics, and he apparently was very well received by them. And he represented the Jewish community, making all kinds of petitions. For instance, a man named Joachino Stefani said Jews have to follow the inheritance rules that are in the Bible. They can't do inheritance their own way, following Roman law. And Tranquillo Corcos said no, and he managed to show him this. Tranquillo Corcos got involved with polemics. He was very angry that at the sermons they used to have Jews listen to on Sabbaths, that there was a verger, somebody with a verger, a large stick, who would hit the Jews who were, guess what, sleeping during the sermons. They slept. It was, after all, they had just eaten cholent and they had to go to the sermon. Tranquillo Corcos also, and this is where we come to our conclusion, was very much involved in problems of kosher meat. What is the big deal of kosher meat and Jewish food? Well, here, folks, is Jewish food. I want to talk a little bit about food as I bring these two talks to a close. Artichokes like this you've never seen, not unless you've been in Rome, and not unless you've been in Rome in April. These are huge, absolutely huge. One makes a whole meal. And you don't eat them by boiling and peeling off the leaves and just sucking at the end. No, sir. This is mine. I made this. You have to know how to clean them. These are Israeli artichokes, by the way. Occasionally you get a good artichoke in Israel. It's very hard. They have to be what they call in Rome capati. If you go to Milano, they will not know what capati is. It means cleaned. Vegetables are capati. You see that I've cleaned off all the outer. This isn't just the heart of the artichoke, it's much more. It is then, if it's what's called carciofi alla Judea, which is the rage in all of Rome today, what's original Roman food? Jewish food. I'm talking about acculturation. It works both ways. And in the past 10 years, it's spread all throughout Rome. They don't make it right. You have to cut it. You have to fry it in oil at the temperature, moderate temperature. Get rid of all the oil and then fry it again, and it will open up like a flower. Now, I didn't do that. This, I admit, was made in a Ninja Foodie. It's actually air fried, but they still look beautiful. I assure you, you eat everything that's there. It's delicious. In other words, Roman food and Jewish food are very much alike, but of course they would be very much alike. Roman Jews make great pasta, by the way, even if, of course, if it's with a meat meal, you don't put cheese on it. They make wonderful things with zucchini. They raise zucchini just for the flowers, special zucchini flowers, which are filled with batter and anchovy paste, filled with mozzarella and anchovy paste, and then batter, and also deep fried. Phenomenal, because you don't eat it every day, but it's wonderful. Jewish food, Roman food, Jewish food. What about meat? In 1723, Tranquillo Corcos wrote an angry letter to papal authorities. He said, look, it's illegal. We know it. We have a problem with meat. What is our problem? We slaughter animals, and we simply cannot do the nikur. We can't clean the hindquarters of the whole animal. And we give one of the hindquarters to a Christian butcher. And this has been the custom from time immemorial, and I can guarantee you that when he's writing this in 1720, it is indeed hundreds and hundreds of years. And he said, and the popes have permitted it, so why has somebody come along now, as somebody had, and said, no, you can't do it anymore? This is one of the great stories of Rome. Because it, in fact, is canonically illegal. Christians can't eat food that Jews would eat, because Jews won't eat food that Christians prepare for them, as you may know. But they say it disdains Christianity. It creates impurity if we do this. There are 3 chapters in an 11th century collection of law, 12th century collection of law, which make it very clearly that it creates impurity by contact at the table. And this goes back to Paul too. We're back to where we were at the beginning of the first lesson. It creates impurity, but Tranquillo Corcos says, well, we know that, and the popes know it, but they've been giving us permits, written permits, for the last 250 years, allowing us to do this thing, to sell this. And in fact, how does it done? How does it go along? Are the Jews handling all this and selling the meat to Christians? No. The Jews are selling the meat wholesale to Christian butchers, but going one further, it turns out that by the 18th century, the official butchers of the Jewish community of Rome are Christians. Yes, Christians. There is a symbiosis here. This is the fine point, the nuance of what was going on. Now, of course, it's all very complicated. It, by the way, gets involved with Jewish women as butchers, as real butchers. There's a question whether women were doing shchita. I don't really think so, except maybe of chickens or something like that. But Jews were eating meat, which also was problematic because it was bufala. Bufala, maybe you've seen mozzarella di bufala. You have to really go to Rome or to Bari or to Naples to get the real thing. But the mozzarella may taste wonderful, but the meat of this sort of ox isn't so wonderful. But that's what Jews were eating because it was cheap. But in order to handle it, they needed a Christian partner. You couldn't do it without a Christian partner. So there we are. I won't go on much further because I believe my time is up. But there we are, Jews and Christians living together to the point that even on something so fundamental as meat, Jews and Christians are absolutely dependent on each other, and that they were dependent, that they needed to eat kosher meat. I bring us back to close to the story of Anna del Monte. Because when Anna was taken to the Casa di Catecumeni, they asked her what she wanted to eat. And she said, 2 eggs. Well, you're not going to survive for 12 days on eating 2 eggs. And not only that, she said, one I kept aside to count the days, the other I ate. Why an egg? Is it possible to corrupt an egg? Is it possible for an egg in a shell, an unbroken shell, to be corrupted even if you pass it through the worst kind of heaven knows what? No. Kashrut was essential. She said, do not rubare l'anima. Do not steal my identity. And it's that sense that carried the Jews through this ghetto period until afterwards, until they got out, until today they're so integrated into the Roman community. Thank you.